Welcome to the Life Expansion After 50 podcast. In the current series of episodes, I'll continue to shine a light on how the emotional area can hijack us, the role we play in that hijacking, and what we can do about it. Now, from time to time, I may use the term anxiety. I'm referring to the everyday anxiety business owners and leaders can experience. This is not about mental health. In fact, my focus is on how we navigate through that barrier that we run into as we pursue a life that we design that exists above the line. Now, in her book, Willpower Instinct, by Kelly McGonigal, she introduces the idea that besides I will power, we also have I won't power and I want power. It goes farther because we can get into I don't want power and I wish power and more. Now, for the topic here, I'll limit it to willpower and I don't want power. The point being that won't power and I don't want power are close enough to combine for my purposes. Now, put it in context. These powers are there for our self-control and being able to choose between that which helps us and that which harms us. In other words, they're there for our own good, even though they may seem to get in the way. It gets interesting when the I don't want power conflicts with the I will power. You can imagine that happening when a person is adamant about not wanting to move. This is an example. Then the opportunity of a lifetime comes their way, but they'll have to move to take the job. On the surface, they make the decision that this opportunity is worth moving for. Now, let's say for this example that the new position also requires them to pass a series of difficult exams that are well within their capability as long as they study and prepare. So they set out to begin studying and preparing using the processes that have always served them, but for some reason they can't focus. The harder they try, the less they do, and the more stress they experience. Then the deadline starts to draw near and the stress goes up. They're trying to study, but it's taking them longer, twice as long to do half as much. Plus, they're losing sleep, and they notice that their muscles are in knots. In the end, they pass the exam, they get the position, and begin the process of moving, only to be met with obstacle after obstacle and setback after setback. Let's take a look at the above through an I don't want and I will lens. In this scenario, the person was adamant about not moving. This means there were no doubt numerous times when they voiced their opposition to moving with great emotion. Now remember, emotion drives neural pathways. When that position emerged and they decided consciously that moving is okay now, their unconscious network doesn't get the message. The deep neural pathways that are there, ready to fire at the first sign of even thinking about moving. Now, although they want the position and they're trying to study, the unconscious is creating obstacles because it's trying to keep them from harming themselves. As the unconscious interpreted all that emotion associated with not moving as it must be really bad, which equates to avoid this like a hot stove. But since they want the position, they push forward. Now they're pushing against the resistance of the unconscious to studying, and the resistance is pushing back. And here's where the term, what you pay attention to expands, comes into play. It may not be the neuroscience way of describing it, but consider that as you push against the resistance, you're putting conscious energy into that effort, and since your unconscious considers something that you don't like as also not good for you, it wants to prevent it. At this point, it's acting on behalf of your survival, so it naturally will draw energy from anywhere that it can to ensure you survive. This is where that fighting against yourself feeling comes in. Now, I haven't done the research on it, but my gut tells me this is one of the elements behind why there's so much anxiety today compared to a few decades ago. Between social media and the speed and ubiquitousness of online advertising, we are bombarded with cues daily. Combine that with the fact that a large percentage of advertising headlines are somewhat connected to the reader not being enough, or worse, there's some impending doom just around the corner, and you can see why it seems like there's no rest. Now, let's look at another example. Imagine a researcher with rats in a cage. The researcher is testing the resilience and learning capability of the rats by electrifying the tiles in the rat's cage. The rat learns which tiles to avoid and goes on with its life. Then the researcher randomly electrifies all the tiles at random intervals, making it impossible for the rat to learn or see any patterns. What do you think will happen? Perhaps the rat finds a safe tile until it goes hot and then runs around to find another safe tile and waits for the next one. Now that's just a mental simulation, but use your imagination. Regardless of what you come up with as a possible outcome, consider the following. If there's danger all around, we're going to be in protective configuration, meaning we're not working to expand or pursue purpose. This is basically a stress response. When we are faced with danger, cortisol courses through our bodies, wreaking havoc on our system, as the stress response was never meant to last for days, let alone months. Now, because of this ease with which humans can catastrophize and get into fight or flight, is actually one of the cognitive biases, this catastrophizing. The threat of an impending event can have more leverage than the event itself. In other words, we can magnify the threat in our minds to hyper levels, leading to more cortisol and starved cells. Again, I'm just amusing here, but my takeaway is this. In our lifetime or the next, I don't expect the unconscious to stop processing at a speed of 11 million bits of information per second, nor do I expect it to not look for threats, as its basic charge is to keep us safe. Unfortunately, the unconscious does a lousy job of discerning the actual probability and severity of a threat, turning virtually every unfamiliar thing into a tiger-like sighting. Keep in mind, trying to suppress these ensuing emotions only makes the peril grow in our representation, because the unconscious will meet that intended suppression with more survival reactions to keep us safe from the supposed tiger. So suppressing is not the solution. Ignoring can work until the unconscious breaks through, but that is a potential strategy. The long-term strategy is to place the conscious mind in charge like it's supposed to be, which makes it easier to put a pause between stimulus and reaction, and move certain types of assessments from the unconscious network to the conscious mind. A third thing you can do is retrain the unconscious network to view 99% of the previously perceived threats as just normal everyday stuff. Retraining takes about 6 weeks, but it's only a few minutes a day. Now, here are some steps I see as giving ourselves a break. Retrain the unconscious to assess the unfamiliarity and bad news differently. This stops the problem before it begins. Another, train your conscious mind to enter a mindful state at will and in minimum time. I'm talking seconds. This can be done with certain kinds of meditation. Now, this allows us to stop the snowball from rolling while it's still small. Another one, learn to modulate your emotions, so rather than a negative emotion turning into a spiral, you surf that wave of the emotion and let it pass. Now, this is not suppressing it, but rather learning from it and allowing the rush and the sensations. You can read more about this in the book 90 Seconds to a Life You Will Love by Joan Rosenberg. Another one is that you can change your paradigm so that setbacks, inconveniences, and everyday risks are not seen as threats at all, but rather the necessary stumbles on the way to your purpose. Remember, if you're rising above the line, you're in unfamiliar territory, and stumbling is par for the course. So we shouldn't see those as threats and problems as setbacks. They're merely part of the learning process. Now, all of these are easier said than done, but all can be done in less than 9 months, which is infinitely better than living in cortisol world for the next few decades. Now, just to put this in a little bit more context, you may remember as a teenager using your willpower and discipline to basically do anything. And then somewhere along the way, not sure when, maybe it was in your early 30s, that willpower seemed to weaken. Maybe it was even in the 20s. Well, here's what's interesting. When researchers show the brain in what areas light up, they find that the I don't want and the I won't power and the I want power, those light up in the prefrontal cortex. Now remember, the majority of the prefrontal cortex forms between age 19 and 26, or 27, depending. That means we didn't have I don't want power and I want power and I won't power in our teens for the most part. So as the prefrontal cortex develops, it receives the conditioning from the rest of the brain and the unconscious to formulate its executive functions, which is what the prefrontal cortex is there to do. So you kind of see what's going on here. That loss of willpower that we noticed in our 20s and 30s, is it really a loss of willpower, or is it just the fatigue of fighting against ourselves as the I want and the I don't want powers engage? It's probably a little bit of both. Remember, the brain uses about 20% of a daily's worth of metabolism. So there's a lot of work going on in the brain. And if you're fighting against yourself, that percentage increase on that 20% can be pretty significant. So it's no wonder that we get fatigued. Kelly McGonigal in her book, Willpower Instinct, also talks about decision fatigue and how the amount of decisions we have to make impacts our willpower. Not only is our willpower decreasing as the day goes on, but perhaps the fatigue from the fighting against the I don't want power can exacerbate that problem. Now, I started this episode by talking about I don't want power. You can begin today to see that as the same power that helps you with self-control. Next, recognize that the majority of impulses are based on past associations. That recognition alone can provide enough context to put a pause between the impulse and the decision to adopt it as fact. In other words, if you can see the I don't want power for what it is and indicated that there is a possibility, only a possibility, that a risk may be present, then you can consciously investigate what you can learn from it. You know, there's a constant theme here of looking at the unconscious impulses as a data point from that vast network of associations that occurred in the past. Since we're moving into the future, and especially if we're moving into new territory above the line, the majority of those past associations, I think, warrant a second and a third look. So that's what it is. In doing the above, you're in effect turning the impulse into a data point, as opposed to a threat that you have to avoid. So I'll continue the series with a different look at the emotions. It's slowing down a bit because there's a lot to unpack. And soon I'll get into how we use these emotions to help us. That can be seen as a fifth strategy, because with enough positive emotion, there isn't the capacity or context for the negative impulses to enter. So I'm going to leave it there. We'll tune in next time. Until then, stay strong.